Hey, Diana, did you know that being successful is simple?
Mark, that's the dumbest thing you've ever said.
Ladies and gentlemen, jurists and just curious, welcome to the Successful Barrister Podcast. Here you'll learn about marketing, management, and life skills for lawyers that probably won't get you disbarred. Hosted by Marc Whitehead, a seasoned lawyer who remembers when fax machines were cutting edge, and Diana Berry, attorney, COO, and the brains behind the scenes. Together, they are the legal world's most dynamic duo since statutes met regulations. So if you're looking to build a practice, not a prison, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Successful Barrister, where legal legends are made.
And welcome to the Successful Barrister Podcast, the podcast for lawyers about marketing, management, and life skills that probably won't get you disbarred. I'm Marc Whitehead, your host, here alongside my number two, my COO, my right hand, Diana Berry. Hey, Diana, what's going on?
Hey, Mark. It's cold.
It's cold. Everybody's sitting there shivering. It's gotten into the 30s in Houston, Texas, and everybody just loses their mind when it gets into the 30s.
Yep, even without the snow and the ice, it's still just too cold for us.
Yeah, I know. It kind of makes me want to puke when I hear people complain about it. Oh my
I'm not
God.
complaining, I'm commenting. I am really also very excited about today's podcast.
Okay, so today we're going to do slightly different as opposed to Diana has been complaining lately that, Mark, we keep doing book reports.
That was a complaint, not a comment.
Was a
that
complaint.
was a legitimate complaint.
No book report today, although I think our format of reviewing books and using them as a theme for discussion is a good format. Today we're going to go to something very basic, which our topic today is Mark's top 10 list of things that made me successful. Now these are my own personal opinions, and other people's opinions could differ. People could differ on whether they think I'm successful or not. But I think from where I started as a solo with a part-time paralegal to, now running a law firm with
a national law firm with about 75 people that were
75 people,
Yeah.
Massive payroll. We have 11 locations. We have, 4,500 active files. I would consider that's fairly successful. Now, there's plenty of people that are bigger than that. But I define success a little bit differently. One of the ways I define success is I live an extremely nice life. I can go into any restaurant and drop down an Amex and pay for a lovely dinner and not think twice about it. That's actually my definition of success.
Oh, food?
Of being able to walk into any restaurant and order anything I want and not think twice about it.
Oh.
That's my definition of success.
I perked up when you started talking about food.
And I will say that 20 years ago, when I walked into a restaurant with 4 small kids, and a wife, and we dropped $200 on dinner, it made me cringe. So somewhere along the line, I managed to get past that. So that's somewhere along the line. That's where I define success at. I don't care what dinner costs anymore. So I've come up with a list of the top 10 things that I think made me successful, and.
In no particular order?
Well, they are sort of in an order, from sort of broadest to more specific, I think, is kind of how I tried to order them.
Got it.
Okay. But they're not necessarily connected. They could be random ideas. So, but anyway, we're going to try to hit all of them in one podcast, and we're going to see how this goes. And if this thing starts running really, really long, we may break this up into 2 podcasts. We're just going to find out. We're just going to go with it and figure this out.
I love it. I love winging it, Mark.
We're just going to wing it.
All right. On your mark, set, go. What you got? What's your first one?
All right. My first one is learn to think, and when you do, think big.
What does that mean?
So... we had a podcast on this the last week or two, about paid to think. What is it? What is the primary responsibility of the leader of a law firm, which is where I'm coming from as the leader of this law firm? What's my primary job? It's thinking. So, but what do I think about? And do I think small? Do I think medium? Do I think big? And I have learned over the years, just always think big. Always think outside of the box. Think beyond what we would call a stretch goal to like a super stretch goal, or what a super Pareto principle stretch goal. And then work your way backwards from there. And you don't always get there. I mean, I've had some pretty lofty goals in the past that we didn't achieve. But when you look at it, we still achieved a lot. So I think you have to start with that premise. And I will contrast this to how I thought 32 years ago, which was 32 years ago, I thought that being a practicing lawyer in Harris County, Texas, and admittedly it's a big county, so there's lots of opportunity in Harris County, Texas. But I thought, being a big fish in Harris County, Texas, was the end goal. And what I realized as I moved forward in my career, well, what about being a big fish in Texas? Well, what about being a big fish nationally? Okay, I haven't gotten to globally yet, but at least I'm going, I've litigated cases in 44 states plus Puerto Rico now. I never would have dreamed of that 32 years ago. I never would have dreamed of litigating outside of Harris County, Texas. So from where I was back then, where I kept thinking very small, very locally, to now the way I think now, where I think nationally about everything. That's kind of what I mean by thinking big. The world is your oyster. But then what do you think about? You have to think about strategy. You have to think about what type of market you want to be in. You have to think about how you want to compete in whatever market you choose to be in. You have to think about, what type of practice I want to run. What is the culture that I want to develop within my firm, I have to learn. I have to constantly be learning, which will be a theme throughout my top 10 list here. Different ways of learning. I have to be aware of national trends. You've got to monitor your competition. You think about that a lot. I look at what my competitors do all the time. Like it's almost a weekly occurrence that we look and see what everybody else is doing. How can we do it differently? Maybe sometimes we just need to emulate what they're doing. Maybe we need to get away from what everybody else is doing and move to a blue ocean. Those are all things to think about. But I constantly am thinking. I start thinking about how can we be better at what we do? How can we be more efficient? How can we provide a better outcome for the client? How can we, improve our marketing, And then I start thinking about the future. What is the future going to look like? How could we affect the future? One of the things that we talked about, I think we started when you first came here. We talked about the fact that we are fee capped in Social Security, and how can we raise our average fee, when we're fee capped by the government? Well, how about we talk to the government and get them to raise the fee cap? Okay? And I'm not going to take credit for that at all, but I am a member of an organization that did promote that, and I worked through that organization to try to lobby, I think it's actually an administrative regulation. You don't even have to lobby Congress. You have to lobby an administration, the Social Security Administration. But thinking about the future of how we can improve things, what's the trend looking like in the future? Now the future is really interesting because we have a new administration. Apparently we're going to have a new Social Security commissioner. Now I don't know what's going to happen, but we're still thinking, what about the future? But I think the first thing is I'm very deliberate about my thinking.
Yep, and I think that, talking to a lot of attorneys, it's almost like, well, I don't have time to think. I'm just so caught up in the whirlwind. We've talked about the whirlwind a lot. It's a concept by, is it the Side Edge? I forget who popularized that.
Well, that's 4 disciplines of execution. Now we're going back to book reporting here.
Sorry, but not my word. I'm not trying to take credit for it. But, there's just so much, when you were talking about probably that same time when you had the 4 young kids. So you're really you're trying to start your own practice. You're trying to hire, but you're also don't know how much you have to pay for payroll. There's so many things. It's like, no, I can't do one more thing. But I really think if we change the mindset to you can't afford to not think is really the way that we should think about it is, And that's what I think that we really see a lot of in our business, or at least what we see with some of our other attorneys.
And I think a lot of people do think, and they think a lot. What I think the limitation is they don't think big.
Which is I think my second point when I was listening is that it is really like an exercise in that it's not going to come naturally the first time. So you're going to hit the same way you would the first time you go to the gym. It's like, well, this is hard. Am I even doing this, deadlift right? Am I going to hurt myself? And all these, questions and insecurities. And then you leave and you're like, well, I don't really feel any different. I don't know if that really made a difference. And then, so you just have to keep going and at it before you're like, okay, now thinking big and dreaming big is now not second nature, but it comes a little bit more easily.
Yeah. And there's two ways of going about doing this. One of this is just setting aside time to think. The other way is doing a more structured thinking exercise. For example, I've talked about this before on the podcast, the Double Your Revenue program through Atticus. You've done that with me once. Mm-hmm. I've actually taught the class as well. It's actually a workshop, and literally what it is a one-day thinking workshop. And so people are like, why have you done it 3 times? Because every time it's different. Mm-hmm. Because every time my circumstances are different and the things that are on my mind are different. And every time I've come out of the Double Your Revenue workshop, the thinking that I did came up with something different, new, and unique. Because the circumstance, I did it, every time I've done it, it's probably been about 3, 4, 5 years apart. And so my circumstances are different. And so what's on my mind, So I always come up with something new and fresh. I could probably do that program once a year and always come up with fresh.
Oh, well, that's a good idea to do that consistently, or do something consistent. Yeah. Like my think time is very structured. I do the same thing at the first start of every quarter, and then every think time has the same type. I review my great life. I review our business plan. I review our quarterly goals for me and making sure I'm pushing everything ahead. And my family ahead, just making sure everything personally and professionally is moving forward. What do you have for your second?
Number 2 is learn from other successful lawyers. Okay, why reinvent the wheel? And I think that's where a lot of people get bogged down, particularly when they're starting out in the practice, is they just constantly are trying to reinvent the wheel. And I know I did. And probably for the first 10 years, I was just sitting there grinding away, reinventing the wheel, just thinking I could outwork everybody else. And it just, after a while, I started realizing, and the first person who mentioned this to me was Jim Perdue Sr., who is a very well-known, respected trial lawyer here in Houston, Texas, and also teaches at the University of Houston, I believe. I'm not sure if he still teaches, but he did for a while. And he told me about this concept where he would get together with other lawyers from around the country, and they would visit each other's law firms. And I thought that was just sort of a strange thing. But he goes, we would visit each other's law firms, see how everybody ran their businesses, and learn from each other. And I'm like, that's strange. And then I got introduced to the book by Napoleon Hill. Was it Think and Grow Big? I'm blanking on the name.
I don't know that one.
All right. It's a Napoleon Hill book. It'll come to me. I'll repeat it after I can look it up in the break. But it mentioned he had interviewed a bunch of successful people like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and so forth. And one of the things that he came up with was the concept of the mastermind, which... And looking backwards, like, oh, that's what Jim Perdue was doing. He had a mastermind. He just didn't call it that.
Yeah.
But a mastermind is when a group of like-minded business people get together and they share their best ideas. Okay, that's a formal way of doing it. But all of a sudden it clicked into my head, oh, that's actually a thing. And how can we actually do this? Well, you can do it informally. So the informal way is to start getting involved with groups of successful lawyers. I mean, we started getting involved with, from the very beginning, Texas Trial Lawyers Association, Houston Trial Lawyers. But then we took it a step further, started going to AAJ, which is our National Trial Lawyer Group. We started going to NOSCR, which is our National Social Security Group. We started going to NOVA, which is the National Organization of Veterans Advocates. We started going to these groups and started hanging around with like-minded people and start learning from like-minded people. Then I took it a step further than that. I was at a Litify our LitiQuest conference here in Houston, and John Morgan, the biggest plaintiff's lawyer in the country, happened to be there, and he was a speaker, and I happened to be sitting on the front row. And of course, I had my name tag that said Mark on it, real big. And so John, what I learned is that John picks out one person when he's speaking to talk directly to that one person. So he picked out me, and he started talking, hey, Mark, and he was giving his presentation, but kept addressing me directly. And I'm like, holy crap, this person doesn't even know me. And I'm relative to John Morgan, I'm small fry. So I went up and talked to him afterwards. And he goes, hey, Mark, you should come to Orlando and visit us, and I'll show you around how we do things. And what I found out later is he makes that offer a lot, and rarely do people take him up on it. Well, I took him up on it. And I flew myself, I flew my marketing director, and I flew, I think, either one or two of my attorneys. We all flew to Orlando for the day to check out John Morgan's shop.
Wow.
Now, John didn't give us the tour. He was busy. But he had one of his lieutenants, and we spent the entire day at Morgan & Morgan in Orlando and looked at their operations. We looked at how they set up their software. We're using the same software, Litify software. We looked at a lot of things and just blew my mind how they had things structured. And we came back and totally restructured how we had things set up based off of what he did. We did it again. Now, I didn't go on this trip. You went on this trip.
Yeah, still one of my favorites, I think, of all time.
We were fortunate enough to get the same invitation from Pond Lahaki, which is a law firm it was in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And they have a similar practice to ours, although I think it's on a much larger scale. It is. Because they actually have a PI wing as well and a workers' comp wing, which in Texas we don't get to do. You went with a couple of lawyers.
I did. And
y'all spent the day, and they did the same thing. They showed you how they ran their operations.
Absolutely.
Tell me what you learned.
All the things. I'm still, and thinking about it, I still go back to my notes from that trip when I'm like, okay, what am I doing next? And are we doing this correctly? Or if I remember that we have this little problem and like, how do I solve it? And Litify, because they use the two of the same platforms that we do, that we've mentioned here on the podcast. Litify is our case management software, and Case Status, which is our client portal or client messaging app. And so, when I have little things like, golly, I wish it worked better. I go back to my notes, and, still one of my favorite things I've mentioned before, you take me to a lot of these conferences. I go to AJ, I go to the Atticus coaching, I go to PILMA, and I'm very grateful for the investment that you make in me. That one day trip that you were like, okay, well, fine, go, but I don't really know what you're going to learn. Still learning from it, still taking things from that one trip.
Okay. So learn from other successful lawyers. All right. The third one we're going to do, we're going to fit one more in before we go to the break. Read a lot of books. Mm-hmm. I am constantly reading. Hence, the format of this podcast tends to revolve around books that I have read or you have read.
So are these your favorite books, Mark?
So I have a list of some of my favorites. I have a list of my 30 favorite books that I email to people because people ask me. Can't cover all 30 of them here, so I kind of think I picked out about 8 or 10 that I'll just rattle off real quickly. But so the whole purpose, most of the books that I read are not about the profession of law or legal. I mean, they are just basic business books. And I think that lawyers can learn so much by looking outside of the legal industry, because quite frankly, as a whole, the legal industry is run very poorly relative to other industries.
Yes.
We are way behind the times. Everything we do is like 20 years behind the times. So I think it's good to look outside of law, although it goes kind of against what I just said. But in terms of legal books, I don't find a lot of them that useful, although there are a couple. So my favorite one, and we've talked about this endlessly, is Traction by Gino Wickman. A lot of his concepts are based off of E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, who is based off of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. These are like kind of the top 3 books that just lay the foundation out for basically running a successful practice, running a successful life, quite frankly. Drilling down a little bit further, I love the 4 Disciplines of Execution, which we've talked about. It's actually how once you come up with these grand plans, you got to figure out how to execute, or else it's just kind of a pipe dream.
Yeah.
Legal book, You Can't Teach Hungry by John Morgan. I will give a shout out to John Morgan, since we just talked about him a minute ago and how nice he was to me. It's a good read. It's an easy read, and you have to dig into it a little bit to get some nuggets out of it, but I still think it's very worthy of reading. He had a sequel to that. I think it's You Can't Teach. I can't remember what the last one was. He wrote a second one. These are two we're going to have to look up in the break and tell everybody. Good to Great by Jim Collins. We've talked about that one. I'll throw this one out. Cash Flow and Profitability by Sean McNallis at Atticus. Okay, so I'm sure Mark Powers. It says Mark Powers and Sean McNallis. I bet you Sean wrote 90% of it. We'll throw Mark in there a little bit, but even Mark will tell you that Sean wrote most of that.
Okay, all right, good then.
That's a real just good practical book from a lawyer book about how to protect your cash flow. I love that one. And then right now we're rereading Fireproof by Mike Morris, which I think is basically the lawyer's version of Traction. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a good book. As I read through it, I'm like, this sounds just like Traction. And then at the end, they're like, oh, Gino Wickman was his coach. No wonder it sounds just like Traction.
Yeah, we've actually talked about nearly all of these books. Maybe not You Can't Teach Hungry, but we've talked about all these books during the podcast.
Yes. So read a lot. Now, here's my tip. I read most of my books. Actually, I listen to most of my books on Audible because I have a long commute and I spend a lot of time in the car, so I might as well use my time productively. So I listen to a lot of books. The problem is you can miss things. Mm-hmm. So then what I do is I go and order the summary of the book. There's several places you can go. I like to go to summaries.com, summaries.com. You can buy summaries there for like $2, $3, $5. I can't remember what it is. And then I reread the summaries.
No.
And
for the visual
to just kind of let it sink in. And usually for the books I really like, I reread the summaries at least once a year. There are other companies out there that do the same thing. There's summary.com with a Y. Is also very good. I just don't like the pricing model as well. There's Blinklist. There's several others out there. I can't remember all the names of them, but I am a big believer in going back and getting the summary to reinforce. It's kind of like in law school. You read the case, you did your outline, and then for the exam, you're studying your case briefs, your outlines, which you're supposed to do anyway. What I really did is I bought the commercial outlines and studied the commercial outlines.
Oh.
Hey, I was a B student in law school, and that was good enough. It got me out.
Yeah. Got you the law degree.
Got me the law degree, got me out.
You also listen to a bunch of podcasts.
I listen to a bunch of podcasts, so we'll throw that in there. Listen to a bunch of books and podcasts. Atticus has a great podcast. I think we have a great podcast. I listen to our podcast, believe it or not. People call me a narcissist. It's more quality control than everything else.
I agree with that. Yeah. Tom Tona, you listen
Tom
to?
Tona has a great podcast.
Sapilma, Grow Your Law Firm?
Grow Your Law Firm with Ken Hardison. It's a great podcast. Michael Mogul.
Those are all legal,
at Crisp
though.
has a podcast. Yes,
these are all legal podcasts. And so those tend to be very helpful. I can do those easier because my commute, I don't know, just doesn't tend to be as long as yours. And so like the 30-minute podcast. But it does help you continue to think, right? And for me, I'm more of a visual learner, so the book I like actually touching the book, but the audio, the 30-minute podcast or 45-minute podcast is great because you can forward back, go.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really easy.
All right, with that, we're going to take our first break. This will be the longest opening segment we've ever done, but we're going to try to get through all 10. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back.
This podcast is sponsored by Mark Whitehead & Associates, a national disability benefits law firm. Mark Whitehead runs a firm of over 60 dedicated people whose mission is to make a difference in the lives of our injured and disabled clients. Mark represents disabled claimants in Social Security disability, private disability insurance, and veterans disability claims in all 50 states. Marc Whitehead is double board certified in both Social Security disability law and personal injury trial law. Marc has litigated disability cases in over 40 states and counting and can help your clients too. Stop throwing your phone calls away. Call Marc Whitehead at 701-VIP-LEAD. That's 701-VIP-LEAD. Or visit our website at disabilitydenials.com. Referral fees are paid in all jurisdictions where it is permitted. Refer us your disability cases today and know that your clients will be in good hands.
Number 4.
Number 4 on the top 10 list, reverse engineer your future. You know, how do you know which road to take if you don't know where you're going? I know there's many sayings about that, but where do you want to be? And when do you want to be there? Where do you want to be in 10 years? Where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 3 years? What's your plan for this year? So you kind of start big and work your way backwards and reverse engineer. The best tool that I've ever used for this is the Atticus tool called My Great Life. And the way it starts, it's just got multiple columns, and you start in the left-hand column, and it's what do you want your lifetime legacy to be? Mm-hmm. You know, what do you want written on your tombstone? And, you know, mine is pretty simple. I want to be known as a great husband, a great father, a great friend, and a great lawyer. It's real simple. What do I want my life to look like? You know, and then I work backwards from there. All right, where do you want to be in 10 years from now? You know, in terms of both professionally and personally. You know, in 10 years, I want to have traveled the world. I want to develop a law firm that doesn't need me, you know, to function. I want to develop a law firm that, you know, I think we put the number at 8,000 cases. We want to be able to have the capacity to handle 8,000 open files at a time. Well, all right, so how do you reverse engineer from that? Well, where do I need to be in 5 years? You know, where do I need to be in 3 years? Where do I need to be next year? And then where do I need to be in 90 days? So forth and so forth. You just figure out where you want to be in the future, and then you reverse engineer it. I already mentioned the Double Your Revenue Workshop, which is sort of the same thing. It's more short-termish. I would say it's more where do you want to be in 12 months? But it does the same. It's the same process. Is where do you want to be? Now work backwards from that point and reverse engineer it.
I love the My Great Life part where you have to write your age. Like, so after you figured out your lifetime legacy, then into your 10-year, you know, plan, 5-year, at the top of each of those year columns, you're writing your age and then your spouse's age, your partner's age, and then the age of each of your children at that time. It really makes you think, oh, well, I will be, you know, how old will you be?
In 10 years, I'll be 68 years old.
And it really makes you really get crystal clear about which parts of the world do I want to have seen before I'm 68, because there are some things, you know, like Machu Picchu. Do you want to get to the top? And if so, like, you might have to do that before.
Right.
In a certain, so it helps you.
I might need to do that before I hit 60.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my knees. I may not. Yeah, I may need to build that one in. So it makes you really get crystal clear in how old will your children be, and those types of things. That I thought was really unique about the way they built the My Great Life exercise.
So we also do the same thing using the EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, which we now implement within the firm. Mm-hmm. And of course, now they go out 5 years. So in the EOS system, you start looking at where you want to be in 5 years, then 3 years, then 1 year. But
they call it the Vision Traction Organizer.
Right.
The VTO.
Right. But it's all about envisioning your future and then working backwards from that point. And how do I get there? And, you know, if you don't have a vision, you know, what direction do you have in life? You're just muddling day to day.
And I think it becomes real easy to kind of lose yourself again in the whirlwind. But, you know, so many people, I think so many of maybe our listeners that started out or have their own practice, it's like, no, well, I set out to be a lawyer. I didn't set out to be a business owner. And in between then you end up with some, you know, just you have to give and take a little bit, your personal life and the things. So you get crystal clear about where you want to be so that you don't get, you know, caught up with life and down the road without having seen Machu Picchu.
I know.
Yeah.
The
So
knees aren't getting any younger. I'm just telling you right now. They're not getting any younger.
what's number 5, Mark?
So number 5, I wrote, become the CEO of your firm, not the technician. So now this harkens back to E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber. And Michael is a big advocate, preaches the concept of developing processes and systems and then hiring good people to run your processes and systems. And quite frankly, stop being the technician within your firm. So in our world, in the legal world, the technician means being the lawyer handling the day-to-day minutia of the cases. Mm-hmm. Okay? So I've said this before on the podcast, I don't handle cases anymore. I don't have a docket of cases. My lawyers run all the cases. My job is the 3 M's, as I put it. My job is to market the firm, to manage the firm, and to mentor my people, particularly my lawyers, because that's my claim to fame. Is I am a board certified trial lawyer. I've tried a lot of cases in my lifetime, so my job is to mentor them, to teach them what I know. But what I have stopped doing is I've stopped doing the trial work, quite frankly, and it had to be a mind shift. Quite frankly, I had to swallow a little bit of my ego, because I was, Mr. Hotshot. I was a board certified trial lawyer, and I tried the cases, and, I went and got jury verdicts, or I went and, handled hearings and all of this stuff, and I did the depositions and I did the mediations. And what happened is I became a massive, massive choke point. And the organization could not grow if everything had to be funneled through me, if I had to be the chief technician. And what I realized is that I had to get out of that role to be able to grow the law firm. And it's, quite frankly, it's as long as you set up good processes, set up good systems, and hire good people, have good management practices, you don't have to be the technician in your law firm. And we all started out that way. But that's what we were trained to do. We went to law school to be technicians. Law school did not teach us anything about how to run a practice, how to run a business, how to be the CEO of our law firm. But it's a mindset shift. And I had to eat some ego, because there's still plenty of lawyers out there that have that, Mark, what do you mean you're calling yourself a trial lawyer? You don't try cases anymore. I'm like, well, yeah. I know. And I readily admit that. I will, quote unquote, say I am retired from the technical part of the law. I no longer try cases. And, unless I come out of retirement, probably never will try another case. And that takes a mindset shift.
It's so much a part of your identity.
It becomes, absolutely, it's part of your identity. Lawyers have massive egos. I have an ego.
You don't say, Mark.
It's to put that part of your career behind you and put that to rest so you can move on, quite frankly, to bigger, better things is a hard thing to do, from a mental perspective. But once I realized that was best for the overall organization, best for the firm, best for me personally, once I made that shift in my head, and it was about 5 years ago that I made it, quite right before the pandemic, quite frankly, our revenues or profits have skyrocketed because I've built all of these profit centers through my other lawyers, and I've focused on running the business.
Yeah, so what do you tell a listener that's like, but I like law more than I like running my law firm? I like being the technician. I don't want to run my law firm. You like it, Mark. So yeah, this makes sense.
Right. It's absolutely. So there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what floats your boat, then that's what you need to do. Then you need to hire somebody to run your law firm.
Exactly.
You can't do both.
You can't be the choke point, like you said.
Right. If you want to be the chief technician, if you want to be the star trial lawyer, I'm okay with that. That's not wrong. What I'm going to say is you just simply don't have the capacity to market and manage your firm, and you may not have the capacity to fully mentor your people. You need to hire people to do that, or you need to partner with people who can do that.
Yeah, other law firms that we know of have like a true CEO that would do the same 3Ms that you talk about, or a COO to do the things that I do, and they just get to be the named partner, and that's okay too.
Right,
So
that's okay.
find your passion.
Howard Nations is in his 80s, and he's still trying cases, and he loves it. And I would never tell Howard he's doing it wrong.
Right.
You're not doing it wrong. Just I'm sure Howard has got somebody behind the scenes running the shop for him.
What's your number 6?
Number 6, we're getting in a little bit more specific here. Create a sales department. Okay, sales is a dirty word in legal, but it's what every industry does. I don't care if you're selling coat hangers, or you're selling cups of coffee, or you're selling Apple computers, or whatever. Everybody has a sales department. You have to sell what you're doing. What does that mean in legal? Well, we have come up with a different word for it to sort of sanitize the dirty word of sales. And we call it intake. So we have our intake department. The way it used to work is that I or the other attorneys would screen all the cases, and we would sign up all the cases. We would meet with the clients and sign up the cases. A horribly inefficient use of attorney time, because number one, we don't want to do it really. Clients are a little intimidated by us. It's just, it can be done by other people,
And probably better.
Okay, so then we shifted over to the paralegals to do it instead. Okay, even worse idea, because they're overworked to begin with. They don't want to do it, so they're not going to do a great job at it. And quite frankly, if they're really overworked, they're going to start turning down good cases, because if they keep accepting cases, it's just more work they got to do. Yeah. So they're going to start turning down cases. So finally, I was talked into, at the time, a young woman by the name of Sarah was my marketing director. And Sarah convinced me to hire her mother, who had retired, to come in and be a full-time intake manager, to basically come in and do the intake sign-ups for our firm. And I did, and I hired her, and it totally changed things. A little sad. She developed cancer and passed away a few years after that, but she was the start of that, and she's the one that started the intake department at Marc Whitehead and Associates. And so what we did is, we start off with 1, and then you got 2, and then you got 3, and so forth. And as you grow and grow and grow, but my intake specialists, are trained very simply. And here's how they're trained. If a case comes in, they screen it, and they put it into 1 of 3 buckets: a green bucket, a yellow bucket, or a red bucket. A green bucket, they sign it up, and they have protocols and systems and processes that we put in place to teach them how to make this happen, and they're very successful at it. So if it's a green bucket case, sign it up, no questions asked. If it's a yellow bucket, we have an escalation procedure where it's, if they're not quite sure, it's elevated up to a manager, and from there it could even be elevated up to an attorney to make a decision. Should this case be a case that we sign up or not? If it's a red bucket case, they turn it down. There is a process there where they're sort of supervised on that, but generally speaking, they know what case is not worth taking. Okay. And then we have a whole process set up for, how to politely decline those cases. And our system now is we have an intake manager, and I think, what do we have? 10 intake specialists?
Including reception, yes, sir.
Including reception, which we include in there. We have 10 of them. And that's all they do. They do nothing else. When we first started this, I had paralegals. Hey, could we pawn some work off to your intake specialist when they're not on the phone? I'm like, no, if you do that, I will wring your neck. You do not touch my sales team. My sales team is there to sell. Probably do a whole podcast on our sales process and how that works.
Yeah.
Oh, good one. Write that down. and it's kind of funny. We use, I stole it from Wolf of Wall Street. You know, if you remember the movie Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio, he's like, sell me this pencil. And it has this whole thing. He actually, the actual Wolf of Wall Street, who I'm blanking on his name at the moment, wrote a book called, and I can't remember what the book was called, but he was pitching what he called the straight line selling method, which was the whole sell me a pencil thing. I took a lot of elements from that book in creating our process, our sign-up process. And quite frankly, we're a contingency fee law firm. So all we're asking is the client to sign on the dotted line, which is a fairly easy sell. So the hard part is screening and making sure that we want the case. Convincing them to sign on the dotted line is actually not that hard, because I'm not asking them to write a check. Now, if you're asking them to write a check, that's probably a different process, maybe a different level of salesperson. But I still think it can be done. I still think I have friends that do estate planning law that do that. They don't involve the attorney in the sales process at all. They have people that do it for them. Any more questions about that one?
Well, yeah, so I think that very broadly speaking, it's not just create a sales department, but be in control of your own destiny. You spend so much money on marketing and getting these leads in the first place. Don't use an outsourced company.
Oh my God, that's awful.
As your primary line of defense for these leads. I'm sure it's a good supplement for some people, especially if you just can't find the talent that you need. But just keep it in-house so that you are controlling how your money is best utilized.
So many lawyers waste their leads by not having a good sales process. Do not spend $1 on marketing until you have your sales process locked down tight.
And in-house. What's number 7, Mark?
Specialization. Focusing in on a profitable niche and figuring out what that is. If you're a generalist, if I was looking at somebody the other day, their website said they did personal injury and family law and estate planning and criminal work. Okay. That might work in a small town, in a small community.
Yeah.
But it is extremely difficult to market yourself
in those very 4 different
just
practice areas.
when you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. You're basically the lowest common denominator. You're fighting for the lowest level cases. The big cases in any one particular niche are not going to come to you if you market yourself as a generalist. You need to specialize in something. And I know there are rules out there, but the state bar that says you can't call yourself a specialist unless you're board certified, of which I'm double board certified, so I'm a double specialist. But what I mean is finding the niche that you can really become the expert in and exploit. So, in a former lifetime, I was more of that specialist, and then I grew into more of a...
Well, you started out as kind of a generalist.
I meant to say I started out as a generalist.
So for every season too, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then you have to eventually.
And I get
grow.
it. When you first open a practice, you practice threshold law. You basically take anything that walks over your threshold, because if it can make money, you'll take it. But then
it's a good way to figure out what you do like.
It actually is. It actually is. But once you kind of figure out what your niche is, what you like, what you can do and make a good profit at, you're going to make more money when you start to specialize in that, because number one, it's easier to market yourself. It's easier to become the expert in the field. And then once you become that expert in the field, you can charge higher prices, or you can get better cases, in the contingency fee world. One way to become an expert is to write a book on the subject. So I've written 3 books. I've actually written multiple books, but 3 main books that we market. I've written a book on Social Security disability law. I've written a book on disability insurance law, and I've written a book on veterans disability law. So all disability related. And we print those books up by the thousands, and we give them out like business cards, and I'm known as the guy. I'm the disability guy, particularly here in Houston. But once you write the book on the subject and you get that book out there, you by default have sort of become the expert. Side promotional note, coming out with my 4th book on elder law, coming out here in the next month or so. But you can do that. Just especially nowadays with all the technology out there and AI, it's a lot easier to write a book. Now, let me just say, saying I'm a personal injury lawyer, that's really not a specialty. Okay, that's really not niching yourself down, because there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of them out there, and they're all advertising. You need to really niche a little further.
Well, how'd you find this niche?
Sort of by accident. I've told this story before. I mean, I was approached by a lawyer who had lost his bar license, and said, "Send me your Social Security cases, and I'll split the fee with you, because you do not have to be a licensed attorney to represent people on Social Security claims," which is still the case, although now you have to take a test. That's kind of where I became aware of it, and then he got his license back and wanted to change the 50-50 deal. And I'm like, well, I like the 50-50 deal. I didn't like that one. So we started doing it ourselves. And then I learned how to market for it. And I learned there was a market. And it just grew and grew and grew. And it led to disability insurance, which led to veterans disability. And I realized number one, I could make a profit at it. Number two, I liked the lifestyle. Number three, I enjoyed the work.
And so I think, when I was looking at, we were talking about this podcast, you're like, specialization. I'm like, that's great, Mark, but how? I mean, how did you get there? And I think it's, an easy one to go back to, your second point, which was to learn from other successful lawyers. When we go to like conferences like AAJ, it's first of all, just an enormous conference, but you get to meet a lot of attorneys that have so many different niches that it's good to go to those,
right,
not only for the networking, but also to just be like, okay, well, what could my niche be?
Right. So like I have a friend who specializes in brain injury cases. So it doesn't have to be an area of law. It could be a certain population.
Certain condition.
So a certain condition, he specializes in brain injury cases. I've heard people specializing in gunshot victims. I don't really know how that works, but it's there. You could specialize in a certain demographic. I have a friend who is Korean speaking, and there's a large Korean population. So that's his niche, is representing, Korean speaking people. Certainly there's plenty of lawyers out there that niche into the Hispanic market. So it doesn't have to be an area of law. It could be a certain demographic. It could be a certain twist on a case, brain injury, it could be like spinal injury, it could be certain mass torts. There's lots of ways to niche. Elder law is a niche.
And even the one, where we're starting with Medicaid.
Right, specifically.
Really
like a niche within a niche.
Exactly.
Like, emergency Medicaid planning is a niche within a niche. So figure out your niche. Get known for that, figure out how to market for that niche, become the expert in the niche, write the book on the topic. It's easy to self-publish these days, so you don't have to go find a publisher. You can self-publish, but write the book on the topic and use that as a marketing device. So I think but once you find your niche, life becomes so much easier. It becomes so much easier to run a practice. Because you can set up really great systems. All right, with that, I'm getting the high sign that we need to take our last break. So with that, we'll come back with our final three. I'm Mark Whitehead, a lawyer, entrepreneur, and business coach. Thanks so much for tuning into the Successful Barrister podcast. We have a blast creating it, and I hope you find it helpful. If our chats have sparked your interest, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email at mark@markwhitehead.com. That's Mark spelled with a C. Enjoying the Successful Barrister newsletter. Even better, let's hop on a call. I'd love to chat about how we can collaborate, share ideas, or just catch up. All right, so we've made it through the top 7 of Mark's top 10 list. So we got 3 more to go. So we're going to knock these out.
What is number 8, Mark?
Number 8 is finance your case costs. Now, this is peculiar to a personal injury or a contingency fee firm. So this may not apply, say, if you're doing elder law, estate planning, family law, things like that. It's really more about controlling your cash flow, but this is specific to a contingency fee practice.
And we get kind of heated discussions when we talk about this with our other personal injury friends.
Right. A lot of people
So
disagree on this point, but so I used to sink about $25,000 to $35,000 a month into case costs. So if you add that up over time, over a year, you're now talking about $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in working capital that is sunk into your cases. That's money that is taken out of your pocket that you cannot use for other things like building your infrastructure, hiring the best people, marketing. It really is a cash flow crunch, a cash flow issue. And it's got the double whammy of that those expenses are not deductible when they are incurred. The IRS treats a case expense advance as a loan to a client. Therefore, what it creates is phantom income. You have to pay the taxes on that money even though you don't have the use of that money. So if you advance $10,000 on a case to hire an expert, which would be very common in a personal injury world, or if you advance, $1,000 to get your medical records on a particular case, very common, in a contingency fee world, you're always advancing case costs, $400 filing fees, all of this stuff. It is not deductible on your taxes. And although I know a couple of lawyers who try to do it, and good luck when the IRS gets a hold of you, but you can't, if you have a CPA, they're not going to allow you to do that because it's clearly not allowed. And I used to do it. I know a lot of lawyers who do it. They pay their expenses out of their operating accounts. The way we now do it, and have done it for probably about 8 years, is that we finance our case costs. So we create a separate bank account called a client expense account, and we drop money from a line of credit that we've negotiated with the bank, and we drop however much money is needed, and we pay expenses, client case expenses, out of that account. We do not pay them out of our operating account. And it goes on our books is exactly what it is, which is a liability. We get to deduct the interest. We could pass the interest cost along to clients in our state.
But we don't.
We do not, but it is legal in Texas to do so if you do it under the rules and you have to give them notice and all this other stuff. We don't do it. We write that off as a cost, but we can write it off as we go. And then when the case settles, the money is reimbursed back into a client expense account and then reimbursed, then the line of credit is paid off accordingly. It's a little bit of a hassle. It's
really big accounting hassle.
It's an accounting thing. You have to set up a good system to do it.
Because you're dealing with 3 bank accounts now.
Right. You're dealing with a couple of bank accounts. But the point is that it freed up, think about freeing up $30,000 a month.
In cash.
In cash. Yeah. And I have now an extra $30,000 a month that I have in cash that I used to invest in my cases that I don't have to do anymore.
And it makes a lot more sense for the bulk of our cases. We have so many cases.
Right.
If you don't have this many cases, it make more sense.
Well, it depends on how it affects your cash flow. But if it's like it was at least 10, 15, 20% of our cash flow, that's a huge, huge number. Now, there are other ways you can do this. Esquire Bank, we use Esquire Bank. They have a program. Well, they will actually do the accounting for you. And you can basically, anytime you need to advance money on a client case, it comes out of Esquire. Esquire does the ledger for you. They do all of this. They do charge for that service. And I don't know what they charge. We chose not to do it. We chose to do it internally. We felt we had a good enough accounting system and process that it would make sense for us not to do it, to do it in-house. But that totally changed how we did business, and it totally freed up so much cash flow. I used to worry about, I need to write a $10,000 check on this case, but I also need to pay my rent. I need to make payroll. And it started to affect my legal decisions on how I ran a case, or it could.
Yep, yeah.
When you finance the case costs, you don't think twice about it. Well, it's $10,000. All right, let's do it. If it makes the case go, then let's do it, because it's not coming out of my money. It's coming out of this line of credit. Now, you do need to have a sufficient line of credit, and there's a whole thing.
It is still your quote unquote money, but it does become much more, it does create more cash flow, real cash flow.
So in the end, when the case is resolved, good or bad, the CEA account is reimbursed for whatever it is. If the case settles and you get the money, it gets reimbursed to the trust account. If the case gets dropped for any reason or gets closed without a fee, without a reimbursement, then you simply write a check from your operating account into the CEA account to reimburse it. And it's at that point you can take it as a deduction because it is now a loss. So sad day when that happens, but it happens. So, but that totally changed our cash flow. So I would say the bigger picture, if you don't do a contingency fee type practice, is think about your cash flow, because this really is a cash flow issue. And cash is king. So you have to have cash to stay in business.
Very good point. Speaking of, that leads into number 9.
Number 9, create profit centers.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. First thing I mean about it is in our case, that means taking me out of the equation. I am no longer a revenue producer. Okay. I am a manager of the firm. I am the leader of the firm, but I do not produce any direct revenue. I create profit centers. My Social Security section is a profit center. It costs me a certain amount in terms of labor to run that section. They make a certain amount in terms of revenue. That revenue, if you're doing it right, should be, in my opinion, at least 3 times what your labor cost is. So if my labor cost for the Social Security section is $1 million, they need to be bringing in $3 million at least in revenue, which they do.
So you're talking about like product lines,
yes,
essentially.
Product lines, service lines. But you think of your employees as investments, as profit centers. Too many people think of their employees as costs. No, every time you hire somebody and pay them a salary should be a good thing, because that means you're going to make more money. If you're doing it right and creating profit centers, or what we call them business units, sections, whatever. But you're creating these little units that bring in a lot more money than they cost. So they're an investment when you build these profit centers. So we have 4 profit centers, soon to be 5.
Like personal injury, just to make sure I understand your concept, for like a true personal injury firm, like, some of our ad cousins, like, would this be like their pre-lit versus their lit departments?
Could be, absolutely.
Okay.
So your pre-lit department would be a profit center. Your lit department would be a profit center.
And within those, you also could track your, what I would call a tort type. So is it a slip and fall, or is it a car wreck? Is it a 18-wheeler? So then you could really get granular. That's what you're talking about.
Right.
Okay.
So, but each one of those, you have to be able to tie your costs to. So we know what our labor costs are for, say, our Social Security department. And we can also tie other costs to that. We know what the marketing costs for that profit center are. We know what it costs what their burden is for the intake department. If you want to get really granular, you can divide out your administrative people and their cost to each center if you wanted to. I don't do that. I don't go that granular with it. But my big one is labor to revenue.
Yeah, especially for, for our particular practice area.
Right. We always look at the 3-to-1 number. Mm-hmm. How much did it cost to run this section versus what was the labor costs? The directly attributable labor cost to that section. And 3-to-1 is always the number we're looking for. 4-to-1 is better. 5-to-1 is fantastic. I haven't got there yet, but the point is you have to view your employees as an investment, not as a cost. And every employee should be making you money somehow, should be making you a profit.
And I'm a lawyer, so I'm not going to try and do math, but we've email one of us listeners if you want to know how we do it, because we now also attribute some of our intake leads to our 3-to-1 and all the things.
So we attribute the intake department and we allocate their costs across the different practice areas based on leads.
The percentage of leads facilitated, which we have all this knowable data.
So because that is a cost. It is a cost of that department. The intake department has to be shared equitably across the departments, because that is a big part of their labor.
And that was a shift we made in the last couple of years that in calculating our 3 to 1.
Yeah.
All right. We got to number 10, Mark.
The big one, the last one, and I credit Jonathan Harris. My friend Jonathan Harris is great attorney here in Houston. Was in the mastermind with us last year at Pilma. And he started referring me over LTD cases. This was back in the aughts, 06, 07, 08. I call them the aughts. Can't remember exactly when it was. But they were a lot of more out-of-state cases. Like, Jonathan, these are out-of-state cases. He goes, Mark, you're thinking too small. The world is your oyster. You can handle out-of-state cases. And he goes, this is how we do it. You know, he had a big maritime. I think it was maritime.
He still does.
Yeah. And like he was used to handling cases all over the country. And he goes, it's easy. You just, you get local counsel, you pro hoc in. These are all federal law cases anyway. Everything's in federal court. And he convinced me that I could do this on a national basis. So give him all credit. I'm not giving him a referral fee, but I'm giving him all credit.
We still have a great relationship with Jonathan.
We still write him referral checks every
do.
month over that deal. But to think, again, goes back to my very first premise, which is to think big. Okay? I started off thinking Harris County was my oyster. And then, okay, I can go to the surrounding counties around Harris County, Texas. Well, maybe I can handle a case up in Dallas. Mm-hmm. First $1 million case I ever had was out of Dallas, strangely enough. Okay, well, there's other big cities. Maybe we can go to San Antonio. And I started stretching my wings out to all of Texas. And then Jonathan came along and explained to me how I could do this on a national basis. And we just spread out from there. We've now, like I said, litigated in 44 states plus Puerto Rico. Still trying to figure out the 6 states we haven't been to yet. But we're going to.
I think we need to update our numbers.
We're gonna get there. But the world is your oyster. The internet doesn't stop at the state line. You can market easily all across the country if you think about it. We've run national cable, which is remarkably is not that expensive. Not that effective, but it's not that expensive. Oh. When we run mass tort campaigns that all across the country, mass torts, there's nothing that prevents you from operating in all 50 states doing mass tort work.
But for those of our listeners that are maybe either estate planners, so we found some of our Atticusins have found that they've applied basically this principle though by just opening another office.
Sure.
In a whole nother, perhaps maybe wealthier city so that they've got their immediate access to new clientele that do prefer that in-person touch. And you don't have to get a new bar license or get an attorney with a bar license.
So what the way I wrote it down, I said, create a national or at least a statewide practice.
Yeah, some of our listeners might have.
And I get it. There are some practice areas that don't really lend themselves to a national practice, but at least a statewide practice. I mean, today with Zoom, when do we ever meet a client in person anymore? Very, very rarely. We sign up most of our cases via some form of, telephone /Zoom / God knows what.
I think it depends on your practice area. There's still a lot of high touch. I think estate planning might be one of those.
I know lots of estate planning lawyers who communicate with their clients via Zoom.
Absolutely. No, I know it's happening.
You have to think bigger,
So we end where we started.
Think big. Think nationally, at least think statewide. There's a huge market out there. There's a huge need for our services. They just don't always happen to be right next door to you.
Gotta go find them.
You gotta go find them.
This was a great podcast, Mark. Thank you for sharing.
All right, with that, we are probably way past time, but we are going to put this into one podcast, I think. But we're giving the high sign that we really, really got to get out of here. Lunch is coming. We're hungry. So I want to thank everybody for listening to the Successful Barrister Podcast, where legal legends are made. I'm Mark.
And I'm Diana.
And together we're the dynamic duo of law. Remember to rate and review us. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, tell your friends. Visit us at successfulbarrister.com. And visit our sponsor, Mark Whitehead and Associates, as we've said repeatedly over this podcast, a national disability law firm at disabilitydenials.com. And I'm making a special point to tell everybody, remember, review us. Go give us a 5-star review. We really would appreciate it. And with that, we're out of here.
Bye.